One, two, one, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. One.
Welcome, everyone. Allow me to greet you with the universal greeting of peace and blessings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening. Goeienaand, Molweni. And let me attempt Kai Kuchub. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for making the time to be here for the Professor Dennis Brutus Institutional Public Lecture with the Nelson Mandela University. A special welcome and greetings to all of you, but allow me to make special note of our guest speaker. Welcome so much. Mam Nomatamsanqa Tisani, welcome, and your husband. And then obviously we must acknowledge the Nelson Mandela University leadership. And we have the VC here, Professor Sibongile Mutwa. We also have the various DVCs present. We have eManco members present. We have all the deans of faculties present. And then I also wish to extend a special welcome to Ms. Fortunate Jwaga, a PhD student at the Nelson Mandela University, who is also our respondent today. We extend a special note of welcome to the South End Museum trustees. I have seen a few of them here this evening, the South End Museum staff, and then I've also noted a few South End Museum volunteers. We say special welcome to Dr. Pillay, standing in for Dr. Rose Dodonka, principal at Patterson High School. Ms. Nomsa Mazwai, performing artist with national and international accolades. Mr. Alan Zinn, coordinator of IPLS at Nelson Mandela University. Mr. Hiva Magwede, SRC president at Nelson Mandela University. Dr. Jackie Luke, deputy dean. We also extend a special welcome to the educators and learners from Patterson High School. We also have Gamble Street High that is present, all the learners from those two schools, and then all the Nelson Mandela University staff and students. My name is Tasneem Fredericks, and I will be navigating through the program for this evening. It's not too long, and I'm sure the time will fly because we will be having very interesting speakers. Just some house rules for anyone who wants to use ablution facilities. The toilets are to my left. If I can ask everyone to please put their phones on silent, we would appreciate that. And then there are book sales at the back. I'll talk to that a little bit more later. It is an honor for me to be here this evening to be presenting this august public lecture. I'm not going to talk too much about Professor Dennis Brutus, as we will have a very strong indication from the VC. She will be doing a proper introduction. I just want to say at this juncture, I'd like to quote from my favorite author, Milan Kundera, and I think it's quite apt, who said that the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Forgetting, that is, deliberate attempts to undermine memory and persuade people to forget or to misremember their own story. I omitted in my welcome to also welcome the chiefs from the Griqua, the Nama, and the Kora Ngona tribes this evening, the indigenous people of South Africa. And I just want to say that at this juncture in our struggle, this power struggle, not for us to remember and not to forget, it would be remiss of me not to mention that it is day 165 of the war on Gaza. And we are experiencing a genocide of catastrophic proportions. It is a war on children. If we look at the Southern Museum and we look at when South Africa was established in 1948, it was also the same year that Israel was established on indigenous land belonging to Palestine. So I think it's quite memorable, and we are very pleased as trustees of the Southern Museum to host these occasions, because it means more in terms of memorialization of apartheid, our brutal past, our brutal history, and it's so important when we look at what's happening in the rest of the world. We are a global community, and so we will always feel that unless oppressed people are free, we will not enjoy our freedom as much. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome on stage Professor Sibongela Mutwa to address us, to give us the welcoming address. Thank you so much.
Now, Tasnim has promised more than I can deliver. That I'm going to speak about the life and times of Professor Dennis Brutus. I will not, but there is a lot of respect for our guest speaker for this evening that will elaborate on that. Safe to say that, of course, it is he is a doyen and an icon of our liberation struggle, as you very well know. So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this important lecture, which forms part of our institutional public lecture series. I wish to acknowledge firstly the program director, Tasnim Fredericks, who is one of the trustees of the South End Museum, as she has indicated. I want to thank you and the trustees for the stewardship of this important place in our history and for hosting us at this iconic venue in our city. We love the South End Museum as the Nelson Mandela University because it is a place of pause and contemplation for us. Dr. Pillay has already been mentioned, who is representing the principal of Peterson High School. But I also want to recognize the other schools that are represented here this evening. Gamble Street was already mentioned. We tend to have a number of educators and young learners attending our events. So just so that I don't leave any educator and learner out, I would then just want to welcome the education community that are here this evening. Professor Begitemba Mngomezulu has been a driving force behind this lecture and the lecture series in general. In particular, he has done a lot of work and mobilization for this Dennis Brutus public lecture. Begi's enthusiasm, as some of you have come to know, and energy is indeed infectious, not to mention his uniquely independent voice and intellect in South Africa's public discourse. We have among us the Deputy Vice Chancellors that have been mentioned. I've seen the two, Professor Andre Kiet here. I've seen also Dr. Muki Mueng. I've seen the Executive Deans of Faculty here and Deputy Deans, and then other members of senior management that are participating in this lecture this evening. This is going to be an insightful a space of reflection and contemplation. In particular, I want to recognize Dr. Jackie Lack, the Deputy Dean of Humanities, who will be delivering the vote of thanks this evening. Of course, her dean is also here, Dr. Pamela Masego. The family and friends and collaborators and co-travelers of Dr. Brutus deserves a special mention. Here this evening, there are people that have known him and walked with him and lived with him all those years. So we want to welcome all of you and recognize you with respect this evening. And I also want to recognize persons in this city that would have been growing up in this place where we are sitting, but who were moved to other places because of the history that we all know so well. Our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Nomatamsanga Tisani, Usisi, I would like to respect you. As Africans, we don't call our sisters by name. So we recognize you. And I want to recognize Utata Tisani, who is with Usisi this evening. Usis Nomatamsanga is a well-known and well-heeled scholar, a collaborator also of our university, with our university. And she has told me that she has retired. I don't recognize that. So very much welcome, Sisi. The scholars, the intellectuals do not retire. She will be introduced here tonight, as well as Ms. Fortunate Joacha, our PhD student that I've just met this evening. Thank you for choosing to come to our university. Nomatamsanga, you will be happy here. It's a place of not just passing your degree, but it's a place where things like tonight happen. So thank you very much for doing what you are doing tonight. I understand that there is Nomsama Zwai this evening here. She's not. Okay, she is not here. I would have liked to recognize her because we know her very well. So thank you very much, Peggy, for just pointing out that she did not make it this time, but I'm sure she will make it next time. I want to recognize Uput Alan Zin. He is the coordinator of this public lecture, but also the coordinator of our new Nelson Mandela University Press. And we are very proud of this project because of our name and what we want to do with the press, both as an avenue and a platform to locate and document the work that is produced in our region, in our country, by scholars, mainstream and otherwise, as well as globally, because we know that the Nelson Mandela University Press, we have a global repute. I don't know if the president of the SRC is here this evening. I've been asked to recognize him, and I will also recognize him with all the student colleagues that are participating this evening. I do want to bow my head and recognize the leaders of the First Nation groups that are participating here this evening. They are our co-travelers. We see them in many key university functions. So I want to recognize you with a great deal of respect. The community of Nelson Mandela Bay from all walks always stand with us as the university in all our public engagement. We also regard ourselves as a university that is a student. We can only do better as a university if we are prepared to learn from the community in whose name we exist. So I would like to recognize all of you with respect this evening without mentioning all your particular roles. The institutional public lectures for us are a key catalyst for positioning Nelson Mandela University's intellectual culture and entrenching its academic identity. The lecture series is one of the many institutional pathways that we have thought through, which we use to bridge the gap between us and the community in whose name we exist, as I've indicated. The doyen whom we are gathered here to memorialize this evening, Professor Brutus, was a son of the Eastern Cape of this city, even though he was born in Zimbabwe, then known as Southern Rhodesia. His life story is a complex mosaic that does not fit in neatly in any one particular box, so he cannot be boxed. Professor Brutus was one of the 8 children in his family. He was, I hear, of indigenous Khoi, Dutch, French, English, German, and Malay ancestry. So he refuses to be categorized. It is perhaps this complex mosaic that he is that somehow influenced and threaded his literary and poetic personality. Dr. Brutus, notwithstanding his impeccable scholarly and struggle credentials, he lived a life that was free from trappings of power and excess. His entire life story is that of an ordinary man who committed himself to public service and the improvement of the human condition. Through his literary work and poetics, almost always followed the conventional global strictures, Dr. Brutus valued emotion and feeling as an important component that locates his literary work. In line with our insistence as Nelson Mandela University towards being a more humanizing institution and advancing humanizing pedagogies, Dr. Brutus' focus and insistence on emotion, on feeling, on sensibilities resonates with our own philosophy of humanization in a very fundamental way. Dr. Brutus and his generation faced harassment and dehumanization. And in particular, when he was declared a persona non grata by the apartheid state. Life in exile also curtailed his creative exploits and brought more desolation and despair to his life. Yet his literary works, while telling the story as it should be told, almost always left the reader at the end with a glimmer of hope. And as a way to illustrate this point, allow me to quote from one of his major works, Somehow We Survive, in the poem also titled in that name, Somehow We Survive. And he writes, and I quote, "Boots clap the peeling door, but somehow we survive. Severance, deprivation, loss, patrols uncoil along the asphalt dark, hissing their menace to our lives. Most cruel, all our land is scarred with terror, rendered unlovely and unlovable. Surrendered we are, and all our passionate surrender, but somehow tenderness survives." We are hugely honored as Nelson Mandela University to be associated with Dr. Brutus's work and memory. And we are very proud to be using the Institutional Public Lecture Series to immortalize his work and contribution. I look forward to listening to our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Tisani, as well as our respondent. I'm looking forward to the spirited exchange and engagement, which no doubt will ensue. I really want to welcome you all humbly as a steward of Nelson Mandela University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mutwa. Our next item, I had been reading from a program that wasn't updated. I'm now told that Nomsa Mazwai, as you previously mentioned, is not with us this evening. She was unable to make it, but that the poetry will be done by Mandlovu and band, as cited on the program. So if we can have Mandlovu and band on stage, or I'm not sure where they'll be performing, that's our next item. Okay, they'll be over there. Thank you.
Gezibam nemikhonto banditholile abanganaxolo bandikhomba Gezibam nemikhonto noma ndingamemeza noma ndingamemeza noma ndingamemeza June 16, 1976. June 16, 1976. A 6 feet deeply rooted gravelled grave with cracked souls and broken bones. Deeply wounded, with wounds, bandaged by memories. Memories whose aches, pains, and blood still runs like waterfalls in the youth of this very day. A grave where minds, young minds, black natives and black masses were tied and buried. Minds whose biggest dreams and visions was just to breathe through their skin. Minds whose last memories was kaka, stand guns, automatic rifles, hand machine cabinets have taken strategic position in action of separation. Separating blacks' blood from breath, blacks' bodies from health, ripping them in pieces. Peace. Peace was a luxurious fantasy because then Reality revolved around the resolution of rocks, reconstructed and re-emphasized by revolutionary songs, sticks and stones, broken bones, black tears and blood and breath, somewhere running, somewhere hiding flat, fast beating heart, was part of an architect of black hope to prove that nathi singabantu. Nathi singabantu. Nathi singabantu, bantu biko, help us and save us from the system of Bantu Education Act. And HV Verwoed, my foot, 1953 implemented system designed to isolate and deprive Africans from subversive ideas. A system dumb enough to regard black skin as ceiling of limit. A continual legacy of inferiority whose mental capacity is made to believe that it's paper dependent. A house arrest of possessing PhDs and degrees to later train Varnikerk to say yes, boss and no boss. Repeating mama of having little Varnikerk on her back, but later to get that kick out to a nathi singabantu. A mother of segregation. A granddaughter of black subordination. A child of suppression whose prescription feeds from blacks that looks down on each other with classism. Kodwa nathi singabantu. June 16, 1976. A 6 feet deeply rooted graveled grave with cracked souls, broken bones, damaged by internal wounds, wounds bandaged by memories whose aches, pains, and blood still runs through the youth of this very day. No mandinga memezama. No mandinga memezama. No mandinga memezama. Akusizi lutho. Molweni. Yeah, this is the part where you clap hands. So I'm just gonna thank you so much. I go by the name of Funobe Soto. Mandlovu is my clan name. We go by the name of Mandlovu in the band. Thank you so much for having me here. It's truly an honor and a beautiful conversation that is really exciting that I would love to be part of. So I am really, really honored to be part of the lecture today. So I'm going to do one song right now, and then I leave the podium. Thank you. Tina sizwe esimnyama sikhalela izwe lethu elathathwa ngabantu abamhlophe. Tina sizwe esimnyama sikhalela umhlaba wethu owathathwa ngabantu abamhlophe. Bona mabawuyeke umhlaba wethu, mabawuyeke umhlaba wethu, mabawuyeke ngoku umhlaba wethu. Thina sizwe esimnyama dinasizwe, sikalela umhlaba wethu. Wona owathathwa ngabantu abamhlophe. Mabawuyeke ngoku umhlaba wethu. Mabawuyeke ngoku umhlaba wethu. Bona mabawuyeke umhlaba wethu. Mabawuyeke ngoku umhlaba wethu. Thina sizwe yesimnyama. Thina sikhalela umhlaba wethu. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was so amazing. That was awesome. And I'm sure the spirit of Professor Dennis Brutus enjoyed this as much as we all did. I think let's give her another round of applause. This was awesome. Thank you. So apart from the amazing entertainment, we need to recenter and focus on why we are here tonight. So I bring everyone's attention back to Dr. Tisani. And before we have her on stage, Mam Tisani, you've got a very impressive CV bio. I'm going to try and do justice, and I'm sure after I've read it, it won't be everything. So forgive me if it's short in any regard. Dr. Tisani holds a doctoral degree in history from Rhodes University. She has worked in the field of education all her life, from being a teacher, lecturer, as well as executive manager. There she pursued school, several institutions of higher learning, and in her career she straddled between two fields of studies, historical studies and higher education development. Among the themes she explored and wrote about in her research were issues of access and success by students who had previously been excluded from erstwhile white institutions. She was further engaged in research on the desirability and the manner of designing professional development programs for academics in their roles as teachers, researchers, including their engagement in their communities. Dr. Tisani's research in historical studies, which she has pursued in earnest during the past 10 years, focuses mainly on the 19th and earlier 20th centuries, covering the Southeast African region, specifically among isiXhosa-speaking people. She has delved into the making of historiography on AmaXhosa through the writings of missionaries, colonial as well as military officers. She has further managed to unravel the hidden histories of indigenous women with a special focus on queen mothers and their place in the resistance against European invasion. Equally, she has undertaken research in the theme of converts with a special focus on Nosutu Soga Jotelo, who was not just a Christian but a progenitor of the Soga dynasty. At Nelson Mandela University, where the VC will not accept her early retirement, Dr. Tisani has co-facilitated lectures on African women leaders like Sarah Bartman, Nosutu Jotelo, and Suto Kgagabe, as well as Charlotte Manya Matreke and Nonteto Nkwenkwe. Dr. Tisani has presented papers in local and international conferences. She also has published papers in journals and has contributed chapters in books. By being involved in local schools and working with young learners, she is introducing and defining the concept of umakulu at schools. So, Dr. Tisani, please serenade us like the poet and the singer. We look forward to your address.
Such a beautiful evening. It's unbelievable. My presentation is going to be ethno-historical, Africanist history, and I begin by framing it around Vuyani Velem's thesis on Ubuhlanti. Velem, an African theologian who unfortunately passed on, developed this thesis explaining that Ubuhlanti is a sacred place wherein families gather. And in such gatherings, we have the living dead, the living, and those to be born. And somehow, I feel that I am in Ubuhlanti at the South End and then at NMU. I feel that those who have gone before are here. As somebody has already remarked, that Professor Brutus probably is enjoying the music. I would like to believe that Professor Pepeta probably is also enjoying this gathering, this sacred time. And I also would like to believe that those not yet to be born, not yet being part of this institution, will benefit from what transpires here. Ebuhlanti, there is an interconnectivity, and there is a making of wholeness of beings. The living, the dead, and the living, and the yet to be born, and it's a powerful space, and therefore, it's a singular honor for me to be here. And I will not go over what the Honorable VC has done, naming all the important people. I'll simply say, Kamakuyini. I've been asked to speak on this memorable occasion, not on Professor Brutus. The VC has already done so, but I've been asked to look at the role that literature can play in addressing the issues of racism and democracy in South Africa today. Racism, democracy in South Africa today, you cannot wish that on your worst enemy. This is no light work, and I kept on mumbling to my husband and saying, I don't know what to make of this. But we're not going to run away, because we are going to see how Professor Brutus and many others did not run away. So I'll begin by looking at what racism is. We all know, and I'm not going to get into the sociological definition of racism. I'll get into the experience of racism. We who have lived through that, and we who have lived through the vestiges, the remaining part of racism. Racism is the division of humanity into two. One group that happens to be fair-complexioned, straightish hair, regarding itself as superior, And another group that happens to have melanin in its skin, hair that coils, and is then regarded as not quite as, therefore, inferior. So racism is sort of a package of the binary thinking of the Westerners. It's all mixed up, and perhaps that is why it is so difficult to unravel. Therefore, and it has got a long history. When Europeans began to hunt the eastern coast of Africa, taking young men and women across the Atlantic, baptizing them in the Atlantic and calling them slaves. And when they get into the Americans, they are sold as commodity. They are just goods to be sold. That was 500 years ago. And therefore, it is so long a time that it has crept into the DNA of the Westerners. And perhaps that is what makes me lose hope, is that how do you dig it out from the DNA of the Westerners? What is worse about this racism is that it also affects those against whom it is loaded. Us, Africans, the indigenous people, we sometimes join the bandwagon and we look at other people as inferior. Otherwise, we wouldn't be naming people as amagwerekwere. Otherwise, we wouldn't be naming people as cockroaches in Rwanda. Because as soon as we name, then we have taken the person away from us. And we have actually deprived the person of their humanity. Nathi singabantu. That's what Mandlovu says. Thank you for that. And then, when we look at democracy, that is even more complex. Again, democracy is given to be having Greek roots, and then the Westerners are supposed to have worked out the systems of democracy to the point of monopolizing the notion of government by the people. And that is not the case. There is democracy in all other systems. It is not that we have other systems have got dictatorships. We have got African democracy. We have got ample examples of democracies. But in the meantime, then, we're going to be talking about Western democracy. And when we got our new dispensation in 1994, we hurried to Westminster. And that is the hot potato we have in our hands now. We have the hot potato of Westminster democracy, which they didn't tell us that in actual fact it's not working. It's not working. You look at where Trump is and Biden. Those are supposed to be examples of democratic countries. But no, it's having lots of challenges. You look at Israel, David Netanyahu, he says he's a Democrat. And then, do I want to be a Democrat too? That's a big question. So, if we look at this racism and democracy, it's a complex issue of contradictions that is a big muddle. But we're not going to run away from our theme. My theme is, can literature ameliorate the challenges that we currently have in our country? Yes, literature has played a major role in our struggle for change. The rest of this paper is going to be looking at a historical overview. In what ways did wordsmiths like Professor Brutus and many others use the word to fight? The fight had been on. Where we are, it was almost 100 years. From 1779 to 1877, the fight here. And I'm such a nuisance to whoever travels with me, because I would say, then they landed here, and then they moved in, and then they started harassing the indigenous people who were welcoming them. But the fighting did take place for 100 years. In 1877, after 100 years, Sakhili, the king of Amaxhosa, was defeated. And the same British moved immediately to AmaZulu. AmaZulu had success and they celebrated Isandlwana. But in 3 months' time, they had to surrender. They had to admit that your guns, your firepower. And the same guys went on to Sekukuni in the north. They went on to Amampondo, southeast. So by the 1880s, the fighting had been done. And so when a character called Chitashe in 1882 called out, Zem kinkomo magwalandini. This was a war cry that would be given out. Interestingly enough, the women would stand on top of the hills, and one woman would call out and another would call out and respond. And the men were first to go out. The men could not stand the call, Zem kinkomo magalandini, and they had to come out. But on this particular time, Chitashe, who also is known as Wauchope, in 1882 said, Phuthuma ngosiba, fetch your treasure with your pen. This was a strange call. Phuthuma ngosiba, fetch your treasure. Inkomo represented land. Inkomo represented women and children who were being abducted by the Europeans. Inkomo represented all the stock, all the treasure. But now Chitashe says, Phuthuma ngosiba. But there was a response. Ngosiba is a pen, by the way. Ngosiba is a pen. Fetch with your pen. There was a response. And by 1885, a young man then had established Izimvo Zabansundu. John Tengo Jabavu had established Imvo Zabansundu, and he was saying, through the word, the indigenous people are going to share ideas. They had discovered the Western secret of reading and writing, and they picked it up. And they felt it was time to try this one. It was time to try this word. It was time to use Usiba, the pen. But it didn't mean that the war was over. It wasn't over at all. So when the call was for the word, the word is an established tradition among African societies. Spoken word, even today, we have just heard a rendition by Mandlovu. Thank you very much, because I don't need to expand to that. The word is established and it thrives, and we are not going to lose it, but we simply have also picked up the written word as well. And so, if we look at Professor Brutus, he would have been affected by the word. Sometimes these skills are gifts that we inherit. And I would dare say Professor Brutus would have picked up the skill of being imbongi, mogi, from his Khoi side. He would have picked that up, and he would have kept the writing one from the other German or Swiss line, because you can see how he beautifully combined the word. So if we are talking about Prof. Brutus, we are talking about somebody who celebrated who he was, including the skills. But I'm still talking about the response that was given to Zemkinkomo Magalandini. By the beginning of the 20th century, that is 1900, it was clear that plans had to be made because the Europeans of Dutch and English descent got together and formed the Union in 1910 and excluded the indigenous people as if they did not exist. A crucial point in racism. Racism refuses to acknowledge the humanity of the indigenous people. Racism refuses to acknowledge that the people singabantu nati. So when they formed the Union in 1910, as if the people didn't exist, as if the indigenous people were not there. But it was not enough. By 1913, they had passed the Natives Land Act, which meant that they took 87% of the land. Where were the indigenous people going to live? That was not their problem. And by 1913, 1914, they were busy chasing the people out. What we see in Gaza is in the DNA of the Europeans. The chasing of people to nowhere. It has happened before. It doesn't matter where to, but you chase them. Because in fact, they can as well go underground as ants, or they can go up the trees as birds, because they really are not full people. So, the people had to go back to the pen. It was time for the pen. A call had been called for Usima. Interestingly enough, there is a woman who is hardly known, and whoever is still going to do her PhD theme here, you may as well pick this one. I'm giving it for you for free. There was a woman called Alice Alexander in Cape Town. And she moved to Kimberley. She had a semblance of education because she was a journalist, the word. She was writing. But she was not just writing. She wrote about the inhumane way in which the African miners were treated. The African miners were treated in a dehumanizing manner, almost the same style as they did on Robben Island. Having them going on as naked, jumping around naked, probing their bodies, claiming that they were checking if there was no diamond. That was the treatment. And it was Alice Alexander Kinloch who said enough is enough. Kinloch, she married a Kinloch. And that was 1896, 1897. So if you begin your research, you can go to Kimberley. That is where she wrote. That's where she stood up. Because the wordsmiths, these people who believe in the word, also have the resolve. They have the bravery. They have the determination. And you see that in Professor Brutus, and you see it in many of these people I am looking at, and many that I am not attending to. But what is important about Kinloch is that she married Kinloch, who was English, and they went off to London. And when she got to London, she had the word. She stood up now to the mine owners in their den. I think of that bravery when you get to London, you hardly know the streets, but you go on and you say, what is happening in Kimberley must not continue to happen. And she attracted the attention of the African people in London. And for some reason, they got organized and they formed an African association under this woman, initially from Cape Town, now in Kimberley, an African woman. And the African association that was formed by Kinloch and other people like Sylvester Williams was a forerunner of the Pan-African Conference of 1900. When the Africans in the rest of the world, not just from Africa, from the Americas, they got together and said, we are also people, nathi singabantu. Enough of Kinloch, but more of research on Kinloch, because she continued her work. But in the first 2 decades, especially after 1913. 1910, the Union. 1913, the Native Lands Act. It was time that the young people had to act. The young people, they are coming in. And for some reason, they found ways of going to overseas universities because they did not have NMU, they did not have no college, they did not have universities to go to. But they found ways. By 1900, there were more than 100 African students who were studying overseas. And some of the names we know. And they did not only study, they wrote. That is, the word was galloping. They wrote. We have Pixley Kaseme, who in 1906 wrote a speech. He was involved in a debate which he won among the English. You beat them in their territory and you know you've got them. She won that debate. The title of his paper was Regeneration of Africa. This was still the Pan-Africanist movement. This was still the Pan-Africanist thinking. Then the South African Native Congress was formed in 1912. And they felt that it was time to respond to the Union that had excluded the Africans. So Solomon Blaki of Kimberley, he was a journalist, and Richard Msimang, grandfather of Mavuso Msimang, were given a task to collect information about the people who had been displaced. There is the word. We still have the record of the displaced people who were made to wander, driving their cattle hither and thither, leaving their dying cattle, going on until Saul Blaki says in his book, who are we that there is a couple whose dead child they had nowhere to bury? This is the word. This is what the wordsmiths are telling us, and this is what we are to know even in our present dispensation. It was not just Blaki, it was not just Richard Msimang. More work was done by some of these 100 graduates. And I always drop a tear when I read about Alfred Mangena. Alfred Mangena was doing his second year at university. He didn't even have a degree, let alone doing a PhD. When the Bambata Rebellion broke out in 1906, and they caught Bambata and they cut his head off, and they collected the people they called followers, and they had to punish them. They had to show the world. 12 of them, I don't know whether they had decided that it was going to be the 12 disciples, but 12 of them were said were going to be hanged. And Mangena was studying at the Lincoln Inn, studying law, doing his second year, and he wrote to the Privy Council to appeal that the charge against the 12 should be suspended and another charge be put on them. This is what Ngugai Toby calls enterprise litigation. I'd memorized this phrase. I think there's a word I've forgotten. But it is a litigation where you stand for someone else. And Ngugai Toby, whose book has just been recently published, The Land is Ours. It is he who narrates all the work of these living dead. It is he who takes us to the ancestors who stood up, so that we don't go around thinking that the struggle began sometime yesterday, as we have been led to believe. Ngugai Toby, I don't know him, but I would like to say to the sociologists, they must give that book to their students to read. To the historians, they must give that book. To the law people, they must give, that book must be a handbook. And I've bought 3 copies for my grandchildren as presents, because I don't believe I can have children who have not read The Land is Ours. That is, before I'm pulled off the stage, I'll just touch the last 2 or 3. Madam Fredericks. Masola writes about 2 women, Maxeke and Mqwetho. But the aspect that she writes about is their publicness. They were public figures, unlike the claim that we simply look after our children and cook and prepare supper. We do that. We continue to prepare supper for Chawe. But their publicness was such that they wrote. And the few articles we have that have survived for Maxeke, we have to learn. The key point that I pick up in Maxeke, besides wanting to hijack her as a politician, she actually was into social justice and was looking after the interests of young women and girls. In the slums that were developing, the young women and the girls and Jocelyn Smith were the victims. And some people, because racism mutates, had come to a point where they would look at African women and their girl children as the other, as something to visit their violence on, as we are experiencing. So if we are experiencing what we've come to call gender-based violence, we give it some sophisticated names. Maxeke was calling on African men, and he was calling on those in power that this is not your playground. It was the same with Mqwetho. Mqwetho is a mysterious figure. She wrote 93 poems, 93, almost pushing 100. And I think if somebody does further research, more will come out. And she was talking to everybody. She was not in the kitchen, and she was talking to everybody, calling in defiance, with resolve, with determination, for respect, for end of racism, for human rights, bemoaning our landlessness. If you've got time, you can chase the 93 poems. Opland and Professor Maseko and other people have translated them, so they are accessible. So, what am I saying? I believe that our thinking, our cosmological thinking as Africans was cyclical. We are not linear. We are not moving on from 2024 to 2099, then to 2150. We are not linear. We are cyclical. So we had Professor Brutus. Now, we are commemorating the centenary of his birth, and he is our living dead. We are the living. And a few of you are the recently born, but were expecting to be born. And so we are starting a new cycle. And we, the living, had better pick up Usiba, had better pick up the pen, and had better claim our own. It doesn't mean that Chitashe was not a pacifist. He was one of those who died in 1918 in Mendi. So he was not a pacifist. He was simply saying, let's look at other ways. And Professor Brutus is one of those who responded. Maxeke, Mqwetho, Jabavu, they responded. And I would like to believe we're here because of the wordsmith. I would like to acknowledge NMU for the opportunity I've had working with its staff since I came back home from Cape Town. I've worked with such energetic and such challenging people. I never thought I would be able to think the way I do. I would like to acknowledge Uchawe, Udada wabantwana bam, who has come with me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tisani, for that inspirational delivery. And you spoke about intersection of struggles, and I loved the way you wove the struggle of Gaza, of the indigenous people of Palestine, into your speech. And you spoke about history, and that is your forte. That is what you're an expert in. And I'm always reminded by the story of I don't have my phone now. I'll find it in a moment. I think I'll capture that later. Our next item is the introduction of the respondent, Ms. Fortunate Jaha, and she is a PhD student in literature, interested in eroticism and experimental writing. So do you have a book we can purchase after the event? Welcome on stage.
Thank you for the introduction. It is an honor to be a respondent to Dr. Tisani today. As a student of literature, it is usually a challenging task to speak about literary forefathers or foremothers, not because of the vast work they leave us with, but to make their ideas and observations a presence in a fresh language that still reflects the essence of their work. Dennis Brutus wrote for the most part during the apartheid period in South Africa. According to John Kengasong, he remains in the spotlight of current critical thinking as someone whose works were very influential in negotiating social change in South Africa. His work, mostly poetry, and often defined within the movement of protest literature by literary scholars, challenged the apartheid laws and violence through art. Writers in the post-apartheid landscape have taken new directions, challenging violence, xenophobia, homosexuality, gender-based violence, and critiquing the failures of the state. These are the likes of J.M. Coetzee, K.S. Lodeke, Pasane Mpe, Makhosazana Xaba, Sindiwe Magona, whose work's themes also reflect the remnants of apartheid. Dennis Brutus' activism through arts is defined by Kengasong as a creative activism. This definition is of great interest to me because difficult times, harsh realities, unjust situations require us to think out of the ordinary, to be creative in our quest for justice, to be creative in how we go about challenging power and hegemonic ideas in society. Creative activism has elsewhere been defined by Silas Harebie as a kind of meta-activism that facilitates the engagement of active citizens who strategically manufacture transformative interventions in order to change society for the better by communicating conflicts and solutions where no one else can or will in order to provoke reflections in an attempt to revitalize the political imagination. Many examples can be made here of this type of creativity. Miriam Tladi, the first black female to publish a novel in English, when she would dig a hole in a backyard to hide her manuscripts so the apartheid police wouldn't confiscate her work. Ati Mongezeleli Georgia's conceptualization of Jeff Masemula, known as the blacksmith of Robben Island, who constructed a master key from a wet soap and attempted to break through the prison bars using an ordinary kajak that he built. He and Vusi Nkomani also created highly aesthetic sculptures to decorate one of the prison courtyards, which was actually a decoy to be used during prison escape attempts. The 1976 Students' Uprising, the 2016 silent protest for #Remember Kwezi, female students getting bare naked to challenge the brutal violence of police during the Fees Must Fall movements. Dennis Brutus' efforts as the co-founder of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, SANROC, an organization that influenced the banning of apartheid South Africa from participating in the Olympics in 1961. Indeed, as the anti-apartheid visual artist Tammy Mnyele put it, art cannot overthrow a government, but it can inspire change. Oppression provokes us to experiment in order to create little freedoms beyond institutional restrictions. As Dr. Tisani mentioned earlier, we must not run away. I came across Dennis Brutus' work as a young, eager literary scholar through a search of erotic scholars in South Africa in relation to my work on eroticism and experimental writing. I was ecstatic when I came across an article by Rose Foley that named Dennis Brutus an erotic revolutionary. The article posits Brutus as not one of these writers who left us no legacy, and informs us that Brutus is one of the few writers who managed to develop his talents despite the trauma of exile, which had reduced many to silence. He was arrested in 1963 for breaking his banning order and sentenced 18 months hard labor on Robben Island. He was then released in 1965 and in July 1966 was given a one-way exit permit at Jan Smuts Airport. In Brutus's work called A Simple Lust, he collects his emotional turbulence about the drastic measures the apartheid regime took to curb expression as thrown outward in a steel projectile, to hurtle outward in quivering uncertainty, to a cold fragment of a continental ledge, for hurdling and patching and grabbing and ultimately, unthinkingly, to find sentiment there. The title of this work was even more interesting to me, seeing as my work focuses on eroticism, with the aim to challenge hegemonic ideas of intimacy, of sex, and the experimentation therefore. For me, Brutus was not just a revolutionary because of his verbal revolt against apartheid, but due to his insistence on enlarging language. He was not linear, as Dr. Tisani mentioned earlier. Where certain linguistic expressions were restrained by apartheid censorship, he managed to articulate the same thing, which are the anti-apartheid sentiments, through the use of fresh language. His work is about the quotidian, everyday social circumstances of the apartheid regime, but he managed, through erotic aesthetics and strategic literary techniques, to mobilize it for his form of creative activism. His after-exile poems reflect his loneliness in exile as he longs for home, where the world glows while I pine here, landscape of my young world, land of soft hills and hearts, the day may sooner come of our exiling, of our return. Poems such as For My Wife, It Is Your Flesh That I Remember, best as daily memorable as speech, the shy expressive gestures of your eyes, your patient penetrative mind. And the most evident fusion of the erotic and the revolution is the poem strains with the lines, my country, and ignorantly timid bride winces, tents for the shattering tide. As far as literature's role in addressing of racism and democracy, writers have always played their role in raising awareness about the state of reality. They have always experimented literary and literally. The text here gets used as a bullet. It's alive. It says what matters, radically constituted to challenge and inspire action to go against the status quo. Words can both build and destroy. Hence, writing requires that one is disciplined and intentional, even in experimentation. We see this in Brutus strategically using language to get the message across under circumstances that deny the language of protest, going into great lengths such as publishing some of his works under a pseudonym, as a tactic to mock the Nationalist Party's senseless discrimination. Now, words and language are tricky. Contemporary writers today are still speaking against racism and other forms of oppressions, envisioning what it means to express storytelling that puts forward views, thoughts, and ideas that encapsulate democracy. Writers today are grappling with global capitalist ideas of what it means to write, publish, and sell. Stylistically, they are coming to terms with what Jenny Dupree has cautioned authors against, of how when we do not pay attention to the words we write, we can fall in the trap of reinforcing the very same ideas of white, colonial, patriarchal, capitalist formation we think we're speaking against. In short, any society that does not think, write radically, that shuts down creative activism, that shuts down experimentation is a doomed one. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Fortunate. Before we move on to the next item, I found the African proverb that I was looking for, and it reads as follows: until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. So what that means is until the oppressed class learns how to read, write, and communicate with the world outside, the world will never know their viewpoint. So I think that was something that I wanted to relay to the speakers, because they are historians, they are writers, they are doing exactly that. They are telling the story of the lion. So without further ado, we shall move on to the public discussion. And I'm sure that there are going to be burning questions. We have a roving mic at the back. And I'd like to know if anyone wants to open the floor and ask our guest speaker and respondent on the topic of what role can literature play in addressing issues of racism and democracy in South Africa today. We've got a hand over there. If you also can introduce yourself to everyone, that would be great. And then I note you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Babaloma Kukwana. Thank you so much, Matis, for locating Dennis Brutus within the lineage of the written word and the traditions of writing in this particular region. And I think it works very well with Fortunate, who brings in the context later on, such a conversation that, I think it was designed so beautifully for you to speak from different generations. But in as much as I think we focus on the word and the text and the use of imagination for issues of emancipation, I'm always wondering, because racism is material. There's materiality to racism. How do we move beyond the text sometimes? I know we are going to say, no, we're going to have policies and all of that. But how do we, in our own daily ways of doing things? Because racism is not just a definition. Racism has materiality. It is a socio-economic experience. It is a historical experience. So I appreciate how we focus on the word, but how do we tap into the materiality of racism and democracy? Thank you so much. I enjoyed your talk.
So before we move on to the next speaker and before we lose the essence, I would like to give, I'm not sure who the question was, it to Dr. Tisani specifically? Both of you to address that question that was raised from the floor by Babalwa. Have you got the mic for? No, let's get the mic in front. Can I get the mic?
Okay. It's a very difficult question for me, Baba, coming from I refuse, in my thinking, which perhaps is not clever enough, to get locked into the contradictions or elements of Marxism, or elements thereof, because I would like to believe that different peoples of the world, there isn't a universal way of perceiving and living. And if the Westerners had gone through feudalism and had, after feudalism, went on to differentiate the indigenous peoples of the world to build their economy, that is not the history that other people have. And I will not discern a reality using that stethoscope. I will not use only one way of looking at things. I will look at how some people, as I said right from the beginning, the interconnectivity is the heart of humanity. We have taken the meaning of Ubuntu, we have taken the essence of it out, and I don't want to use it because it has been so misused. But the interconnectivity of who we see and who we do not see, and getting here and feeling that Professor Brutus is here, it has got nothing to do with how much that is going to be. So I'm coming from a different world in the way I look at things. And I refuse to be absolute. I can take elements of that, but I refuse to be absolute into that.
Thank you, Dr. Tisani, and thank you to Dr. Makokana for that question. I think as a student of literature, obviously, it's pretty obvious that I'm pro-text. And I think that this is why, for me, the imagination is very, very important. Provoking people into action is very, very important. Protest literature is a genre precisely because of that, because you provoke people to take action. They're not just listening to words as the cliche of reading for pleasure, but you are provoking something in someone to take action, to be aware. And this is why I'm interested in radical text, experimentation in writing, studying old texts, but relating them into the challenges we're still facing today. So for me, as a literary scholar, going beyond the text is engaging the text and wanting to do something in society, wanting to inspire people to take action, wanting to create or provoke readers that engage the text in that way that it's not just imbibing the text for the sake, but actually provoking them to take action in their little corners, because we are all engaged in different ways in the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Babalwa. Dr. Tisani said, Putuma, fetch your treasure with your pen. That's what she said. Fetch your treasure with your pen. And that may seem like an academic, literal thing, but in fact, it is a literal thing. It's an action item, if I heard you correctly. That's the action item. Taking this racism talk to a racism do. But we'll discuss that a bit more. I know that there was another question, and if we can use the other mic, thanks.
Thank you very much. Basil Brown. Yes. I'm a member of the board of CANRAD. Dr. Sisani, I must say I enjoyed your presentation, which was delivered in a very charismatic way. And as much as I did the respondents' response. You couched your presentation against the background of the issue of racism and democracy. And my first question is, I assume that you are saying that we haven't dealt with the problem of racism, or have we created a democratic state in this country? I was reminded after you when your emphasis on the power of the word, that as I walked in here, I saw there's a table out front where books are being displayed, and one of the books that is on display is by another poet who used the word to empower us, and that is the collection of poetry by Victor Wessels, who was a leading member of the Unity movement in the 50s and the 60s. And he has a poem there titled, "Tyrants Fear the Written Word." And I think that's the other side of the importance, the role that the word plays and the writing does play. And one hopes that the young people, students that are here, will take home the message that they need to engage with the literature of our country. And the writers that you've mentioned, there are obviously hundreds of others one could mention, but I just want to refer to two. I didn't know about this lady who went from Kimberley to confront the Privy Council about what was happening to the miners in Kimberley. But I just wanted to, it also brought to mind that there were two other white ladies who contributed to our understanding of what was happening in this country. The first one was Olive Schreiner, who I think is not properly acknowledged in terms of how she depicted what was happening under apartheid, before even the apartheid system was created in 1948. And the other lady is a lady called Dora Taylor. And she wrote a book, a very important book, called The Role of the Missionaries in Conquest, which brought out again, emphasized the role that the missionaries were playing in subjecting and subjugating the people of this country. So, just to comment on your I was fascinated by the fact that you are interested in eroticism. And I came across a book many years ago that contained two pieces by Dennis Brutus, and the book actually dealt with eroticism as seen through the eyes of black writers around the world. So anyway, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mr. Basil Brown. We've got another hand at the back.
Good evening. My name is Rupert Borman. I'm just thinking of, thank you very much, first of all, to Nelson Mandela University. For a moment, I thought that this amazing and legendary figure, Dennis Brutus, will be obliterated from our history, because more and more you begin to realize that we are unfortunately living in times where if I don't agree with you, I will get rid of your memory. So thank you very much. And evident of that is the fact that there's no real naming of Dennis Brutus. The public buildings, I cannot name any in the country. I think there's a highway in KZN, but that's about it. Nothing is named after him. And here we are tonight celebrating this man. I want to say, in relation to the first speaker's question, it's perhaps our under-emphasis of the word and our overemphasis on the material gains of liberation that has got us into where we are today. The word precedes what you think of yourself. And it is through thinking and realizing through that word that you will be able to advance and gain those material gains you're talking about. I also want your view, doctor and PhD student, on something that could be sounding controversial, but I'm okay with that because Dennis Brutus was a controversial figure. He was a radical. He said things nobody else dared to say. So I want to ask your view on the continued insults hurled at people in South Africa in an official way, where even now, so long after the advent of our democracy, you have people like Dennis Brutus, who looks like him, and even Dennis Brutus himself would have been called colored in an official manner today. He would have had to cross that block colored. What is your view that this is being propagated by a government who's meant to be our liberators?
Sorry, I didn't get your name, sir. If you can just mention your name again. Rupert.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Dr. Tisani, it feels like apartheid is not dead.
No,
it's not dead.
No.
You're confirming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, apartheid is not dead. I actually did say that racism is in the DNA of Western thinking. It is in the DNA, it is in the blood. And I even was, I didn't know I have a word. There is a word in Xhosa, ukubangula, when you take a thorn out of the flesh. That is how challenging it is going to be to try and take the thorn out of the Westerner's flesh when we are undoing and unraveling racism. So perhaps we agree on that point. But when we come to the difficult one on what do we say or what do we do about racial classifications that have been going on in our country. In one of the papers I read here at Conrad, I talked about naming. The fact that the settler began by giving names to people who had been in the land for centuries. That is one problem we have. We've had the naming. And unfortunately, at times, as we get to self-hate ourselves, we're not even aware that we're self-hating ourselves. Fanon says we're self-loathing. We actually join in the naming. And then I will join in naming other people what or who they are not. I tell you, as a historian, my area I'm working on is Southeast Africa, where we are. And I am trying to understand the current research I've got to have in the next 4 months. I'm trying to understand the women in this area. But I am struggling as to what and who were they? And what language did they speak? What did they do? I've read Tariq Millet, The Lie of 1652, and I'm hanging on to him. All these master's, PhD students, there are references that have been given. Tariq Millet, The Lie of 1652, when he is talking about the division of the people of this land being grouped and some ending up being called colored, because that is a new grouping. So it has got a history, it's got roots, but The question is, who wants to be called colored? And who wants to be called colored? Because I worked in the Western Cape, and I would actually say to people, what do I call you? And there were people who would say, I am colored. So I would actually prefix my question, because there were people who are hanging on to that. So that is a difficulty. That is a challenge. That the word that we must write, we must bonga. The bongi must come forward and say what it is that we need to tell the unborn who are waiting at the door. Because we've got a responsibility towards them. We don't have a material responsibility. It is, you can't touch it, the interconnectivity, the wholeness, the integration of humanity. The word is a seed. It can germinate, and that is why apartheid vandals were afraid of it. It germinates and it grows again. So the wordsmith must continue. But the answer, I do not have an answer for what you are asking.
I think on the issue of whether post-apartheid landscape is a reality, I think even in literature it's a big debate on, because as I mentioned earlier, writers who are considered to be writing in this post-apartheid arena, you can see in the text how the characters are reflecting the remnants of the apartheid regime. So yeah, it's and you can even see how themes such as speaking against the way the state keeps on failing its citizens, especially black people, especially black women. It's a big theme in literature today. And to speak about on the naming, especially the question of colored people, I think as a literary scholar in how we engage with literature and how we engage with texts, it's not necessarily saying this is colored people's literature, or because you do find yourself as a young black woman when you engage with literary works of writers such as Bessie Head, who was considered colored. You do find yourself in characters of Alex Laguma, who was also considered colored, where themes of oppression, themes of suppression as a person of color is very prevalent in the text. So yeah.
Keep that. Thank you for that. I think we need to remember that apartheid was a program of separation. And it is unfortunate that that program of separation exists today, post-apartheid. And I think it is something that the government should have addressed. And I'm also reminded about a debate that Tyler, who is a famous singer now, ignited when she called herself a colored South African. So I think it is important, both sides of that question, and I don't think we're here to get silver bullet answers. I think this is to open our minds and to continue this dialogue. Can I recognize the chief? And then there's a hand to the gentleman at the back, and then you, sir, and then you, sir. So we've got 4 questions, and then I'm going to close simply because we are on 1953, and my role is to end at 8 o'clock. So if you can please keep it so that we give everybody an opportunity. Thank you.
Gauchwap Kingas. Kairakna ayo. Hamti Sadunaha. Tarida Kais Gea Sidari Kai. Will they be able to answer that question? Pardon? Will they be able to answer the question?
Thank you, sir. I've got something to say. Not that I know what I'm going, not that I understand what you have said, but I appreciate the fact that you have your language. That I clap my hands for.
Dr. Tisani, so let me continue in your language, in English. Now, when I was invited, which means they are going to accommodate me. Now, that is exactly the problem that we have in this country. Steve Biko said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And then while you were talking about 1913 Land Act, and you talk about one of our unsung heroes, Professor Dennis Brutus, it brought to my memory what was said by our former president, Thabo Mbeki, and I read for you. I owe my being to the clay and the sand, whose desolated souls on the great expanse of the beautiful Cape. And he continued by saying, today as a people, we keep an audible silence about these ancestors of the generations that lived, fearful to admit the horror of a former deed. Dr. Tisani, thank you very much for the presentation you did. And thank you very much to Nelson Mandela University. But it seems that the people, they don't know that we exist. Because every time when they talk from 1913 as if we've never been here. When Bartolomeu Diaz arrived here in 1488, when the Portuguese arrived in what they called Algoa Bay in 1486, the shipwreck that is called Sacramento, and the Khoi took care of them for 12 months while they were here. In 1510, when Francisco de Almeida wanted to steal Khoi women, he was killed in the process. And I can continue with the history because I love the fact that you know history so much. But how come the history starts somewhere and make not mention of the people that was the first in line to defend, according to President Thabo Mbeki, in his speech, I'm an African. He said, I owe my being to the Khoi and the San, who was the first in line to defend our democracy and our freedom. How is it that when there are lectures, when there are literature, for example, we have one PhD sitting there talking about coloredness, does not know where the term colored came from. Myself, I was called a colored. In 2016, I walked with my feet 341 kilometers from Port Elizabeth, that time it's called Quebeca. I walked with my feet to tell my premier I'm not a colored, because your perception about me will be equivalent to your treatment towards me. You have to understand where the term colored came from. It came from slavery. The term colored was introduced to us as descendants of the Khoi and the San to dispossess us of our language, our history, and our culture. The term colored was introduced by B.J.M. Herzog. He said, coloreds must never forget they owe their being to the European. They have no native language and they have no culture. Mariki de Klerk, former wife of former President F.W. de Klerk, she said, coloreds are the rest. All nations were sorted. Coloreds are the rest. Hendrik Verwoerd sê, coloreds are gemoedsbekakte. En gemoedsbekakte is Afrikaans word in the dictionary. It means you have a mind full of shit. Now when we talk about these things, we need to understand where the term colored came from. You can't brag about it. You can't claim it. Even the government gazette of this country says a colored is neither white, neither a native. What does native means? Native means you are from Apa. You are from here. Now when the government gazette said a colored is not from here, because how can you have a person that looks like me bragging to say I'm a colored? And then you have a person that is maybe a Xhosa referring to as an African. How can you have an African and a colored in the same continent? Because Africans are from Africa and coloreds, uvelapi. Let me stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just, sir, before you speak, I think because in tradition I was allowing the panel to answer. Perhaps if you want to answer to that, or you're happy to.
I think at UCT they actually have an institute where they are teaching one of the Khoisan languages. Oh, yeah. Yeah, at UCT, they actually do have an institute where they are teaching one of the Khoisan languages. I remember I have a friend, and I was saying something about how we lost Khoisan languages and all that. And she said, no, we did not lose all. We have at UCT an institute where we are looking at it, at the whole issue of a particular language. I think it's Nama. What I'm trying to say is to agree with what you are saying. But how are we going to plant the seed, the word, which is a seed, and the unborn children are on time to pick up what we planted? What are we planting? The last part of my introduction, which I'm trying to conceptualize, is the idea of umakulu, going to schools. I go every Wednesday to a school and I talk to high school children. I don't talk to, it's not primary school, but it's high school children. And I believe that this idea came from when somebody was saying in Alaska, the grandmothers go to school to speak the language. The grandmothers go to school to speak to the language, and that should happen. The grandmothers should go to schools and talk to the children using the language and even other ideas that we are losing.
Thank you, Dr. Tisani. If we can have very sharp, yes.
Mic on? Okay, yes. It says, what role can, what's this word, Brian? Literature, yes, play in the, hang on now, regarding racism and democracy in South Africa, right? My question actually to you both is, sorry, to you ladies both, is it possible that literature in our context of today, which I'm referring to what Mr. Bowen mentioned here about colored, in the context of BE and black empowerment, etc., is it possible to combat racism and democracy in literature when you have our government still using the terms African, colored, Indian, and white? That's my question. And this is the last question is that, my granddaughter is 11. She asked me last week, what am I? And I answered simply to her, I said, you're a human being. That's what I regard myself also as. So I'd like you to answer that for me, please. Thank you. The contextual of this BE, and also the affirmative action in regard to the role of literature in combating racism and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, can we just get the rest of the questions, and the panel will close on that so that we can move to our item message of support and then our vote of thanks.
Undermining And so I think our lesson for this moment, and if Dennis were here, would be the BDS, the movement, the worldwide movement to isolate Israel over not just what it's done in Gaza, but over its whole history. And I'm sure that he would encourage us all to consider that and to be a part of that. Dennis was proudly South African. That's how he saw himself. That's how he saw himself as standing for South Africa in all that it could be. And I hope that that continues to be the legacy that he has.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you for those kind words.
Can I make just a
Yes,
response
yes.
to the remark that the last speaker has made in relation to the fact that Dennis was a South African, proudly so. When I was writing my daughter, who works in Johannesburg, and I was saying, I'm coming to NMU, and I'm talking about this great man. And I went on to say to her, you know, I think I know her, I think I know him. He's one of those that fought with Maqoma and Sandile during the War of 1850.
Thanks for that, Dr. Tisani. Is there one last question
Yes, there is.
floating? Yeah, that's the last hand, and then we're going to just wrap up the panel discussion.
Greetings. My name is Londile Tswele. I am the prim at the New Res Phase 3. I'm here with some of my students. My question is straight to Miss Jwaga. I just want to know, Guti, how do we as young people, how can we use literature to invoke the status quo within an educational curriculum that is yet to be decolonized? And then my second question is, how do we ensure that the public actually consume a proper media or proper writing in the midst of propaganda and information that might be filtered by capitalists who are yet to be publishers? Thank you.
Thank you for that challenging question. I think as teachers, literary scholars, I think it's our responsibility, especially when we're speaking about teaching within a curriculum that is not decolonized. I think it's your role as a teacher, wanting to inspire your students to really engage, to make them engage with writers, writers that matter, writers, like if you are teaching in a school where maybe it's prioritizing male writers, it's your duty as the teacher standing in front of students to introduce more female writers. If you are working within a curriculum that prioritizes Western ideas when it comes coming to literature, it's your duty as a teacher to go and look for African philosophers, look for African scholars. So this is the provocation that I mentioned earlier, that as you engage and when you can see that something is wrong within the curriculum or something is wrong within the literary works that are in front of you, it's your duty to work towards introducing scholars maybe that are forgotten. Scholars like your Professor Boswell, she's working on African women's writing. Because there was a gap where there was a lot of engagement within male writers in South Africa during apartheid. So it was her taking up that work of ensuring that we are engaging literary works of Noni Jabavus, Loretta Ngobo. So it's always upon you to do that work. Unfortunately, especially if you're coming from the group of the depressed, of the suppressed, you always have to do that work. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There's one last question, Dr. Tisani. It had to do with the BE and the labeling within the legislation, and how do we move away from racism if we are still being labeled as South Africans?
That's a very difficult question, actually.
No, it's fine. Got the question? Okay, Dr. Tisani, do you want to take the question, or do you want to?
I think we've touched on this, on this, and I think in saying that racism is in the DNA of the Westerners, I was trying to say it's a deep-seated belief. They genuinely believe that they are superior. They genuinely believe that some people are not human enough. They even did research. They did scientific racism. They did eugenics. They did grade scale. They had all sorts of explanation to claim that they were correct in what they were doing. So, do we respond to them? No. We stand up. We have resolve. We have determination. We are brave, and we say who we are.
Yes.
I'm not there to be debating with a Westerner that I am.
Thanks, Dr. Tisani. I think there's an opportunity to engage with the speakers after the event. We are going to have some snacks served in a little bit. We're nearly done with the program. If I could ask Dr. P. Pillay, who is standing in for Dr. Rose de Donker, Principal Patterson High, to just deliver a message of support, and then we'll go to the vote of thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you to the program director and to all the dignitaries that are here. It seems so insignificant to be speaking now after all the illustrious speakers and to be placed on the program at this stage. But my talk on behalf of Patterson High is far less academic and less taxing on you, so you don't have to have any questions for me. But tonight, as has already been mentioned, I'm standing in for the principal of Patterson High, Mrs. Rose de Donker, to offer a message of support. And because of Dennis Brutus' association with Patterson, I think Patterson has been asked to say a few words here. Patterson High School is proud to be associated with Professor Dennis Brutus, who was both a student and educator at the school several decades ago. Some of his former students are still alive today and can fondly recall him teaching in their classes. The school is proud of the international figure that Professor Brutus has become in his lifetime through his widely published poetry and other writings, as well as his role as an international social movement activist. The school is proud of the ideals and principles that he stood for, fought for, both here in South Africa and on the international stage. On touching on the memorial lecture's theme of the role of literature in addressing democracy and racism, it has to still be most relevant today, especially if you understand, accept, and agree that the struggle for complete democracy and an end to racism has not yet fully been realized in our country and beyond. In the dark days of struggle, literature played a huge role in enlightening people. It made people angry about the injustices of the day and this in turn led to movements of social disobedience and much more. Literature that was banned was highly sought after and read by anyone who could lay their hands on it. Furthermore, there was a lot of discussion, interaction, debates, arguments, and disagreements, which all led to the sharing of ideas and a bond to engage the struggle. In the past, it was young people, the youth, who were in the forefront of the fight for democracy and an end to racism. Schools, universities, social clubs, etc., were the breeding grounds for activism through the protest literature that was hungrily consumed by all. The challenge now is that it is vastly different today. The youth are still reading, but not the kinds of works of the past. We need to find a way to engage them in a different way. The fire, the anger, the rage is just not there anymore. So in conclusion, Patterson I was privileged to have had Professor Brutus visit the school in 2009. He shared his poetry with students and staff, as well as a bit of his life. He also donated some of his poetry books to the school. I can recall Professor Brutus talking to us and telling us that the poetry he wrote from prison, especially the bundle that was titled Letters to Martha, was actually letters to his loved one, his wife. So having been able to engage him on that level was really something that the school appreciated. And for him to be sharing his poetry with our learners at that time was also something that needed to have been celebrated. The school and Friends of Patterson I alumni was fortunate to honor Professor Brutus as one of his famous sons at this very venue in 2009 as well. Dennis Brutus wrote the words of the Patterson High School song. In this small way, his name lives on at the school. Patterson High will be celebrating its centenary anniversary in a few months. The name of Dennis Brutus will surely be proudly recorded and remembered as part of the school's illustrious history. The school has also recently launched its Poetry Club, a breeding ground to follow in the steps of Professor Brutus. Patterson I wishes to offer its support and well wishes to CANRAD for this memorial lecture honoring Professor Brutus. Thank you.
We will move on to the vote of thanks, but just quickly a reminder that there are book sales in the foyer. We have Time with Dennis Brutus, Whose History Counts, Poetry of Victor Wessel's Critical Social Work Studies in South Africa, Struggle and Hope, Reflections on the Recent History of the Transkeian People. Those are all books on sale at the back, so as you make your way outside, please consider buying those books. If I can call Dr. Jackie Luke now to just do the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasneem. I speak very fast, so don't worry. You'll be out of here soon. Our VC, Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, in her absence, she just had to leave us now. Prof. Andre Kiet, our DVC Engagement and Transformation. Dr. Mukim Muheng, our DVC Learning and Teaching, my Dean, Prof. Pamela Maseko, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Prof. Mgo Mezulu, Director, CANRAD, and staff of CANRAD, South End Museum, your boards of trustees, administrators, and then Dr. Tisani, our guest speaker, Mr. Tisani, Ms. Dwaha, our respondent, Paramount Chiefs, Senior Headman, Mr. Alan Zinn, Patterson learners, Dr. Pillay, our students, honored guests, good evening, Molweni Goeienaand. On behalf of our hosts, the Nelson Mandela University's Center for Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, and the South End Museum, I wish to thank Dr. Tisani. You can see why she is our visiting scholar in our Faculty of Humanities, Sociology and Anthropology Department, for delivering the Dennis Brutus Nelson Mandela Institutional Public Lecture tonight that began with the question, what role can literature play in addressing issues of racism and democracy? In a world wounded with the thorns and tormented by racism and failures of state, her responses, your responses, Dr. Tisani, have moved us. It has shown us courage and it has shone light and made us understand better and given us renewed hope to conceive of possibilities. You've given us an overview of African literature. I was struggling to keep up, so I'm hoping it's going to be somewhere that I can access. You've shown us treasures of the pen and how it informs our world and how we use it to name in not very good ways, but how we can use it as a window on our deepest desires for meaningful lives and experiences of what it means to be human. Thank you so much, Dr. Tisani, for captivating us, living, dead, unborn tonight. We really appreciate your contributions in this space and in the Academy with your work on historiography and decoloniality. We value so much. We're glad you did not run away, as you said in the beginning, but that you took up your Siba. So please, can we show Dr. Tisani some Rebecca? Thank you. Thank you. I also wish to thank our amazing respondent, our PhD student, Ms. Dwacha. We're looking forward to that thesis, for adding your powerful, fresh insights tonight as well in this intergenerational conversation. Ms. Tasneem Fredericks, is the second time I hear you, but I think you are really, really amazing and powerful as a moderator. So thank you. Thank you, Nelson Mandela University. Thank you, CANRAD, for bringing us this annual institutional public lecture. As a university imbued with the spirit of Nelson Mandela and concerned with addressing social inequities and the pursuit of a shared humanity amidst the historic dehumanizations and oppressions, as VC said, we are proud of this lecture series and how it makes us reflect and inspires us to act. And thank you to South End Museum for hosting it since its inception, if I'm right, Tasneem, I'm not sure. But a special thanks to Beverly for your impeccable arrangements, Bev. South End Museum is really well suited for this lecture. It's a place of our histories. I was looking for the street that my parents lived in before they were removed from this area, and legacies of literature, sport, politics, struggles for democracy, and it is mapping out there for us in material form the places of our ancestors in this area. So it is a local environment that Dennis Brutus was familiar with. So thank you for coming to listen to Dr. Tisani speak, to our respondent, and for your warm welcome of her. Prof. Mutua started with Dennis Brutus's words. Many of us have quoted him tonight, and I will then thank him through his words. We remember him as an activist, a teacher at Patterson High, and a poet. And in the words of Dr. Mandla Langa, he brought life to our wounded souls through his poetry. Perhaps his European side was attracted to the metaphysical poets. That's why he liked the sensual, fortunate, and he liked the intellectual, he liked John Donne and people like that. So in a poem, while under house arrest in 1966, Dennis Brutus wrote, "We become a bellicose people, living in a land at war, a country besieged. One wishes for death with a kind of defiant defeatism." But he also wrote of our ability to shape and reshape and for a hope. In these lines, he says, we as humans, we have the capacity to ennoble or pervert what is otherwise simply animal, amoral and instinctual, that DNA. So thank you, Siyabulela. Baie dankie, everyone. It was amazing, wonderful. We will remember this. I hope I'm going to do it right, Dr. Tisani. Thank you. I don't know the moderator. You can tell us what's next.
School's library. Thank you. And that draws our program to a close. Thank you so much. Safe travels. Until next time. Oh, and there's snack.